The department store opened at 9, but Maya Reyes had already been standing behind Register 4 for 20 minutes by the time the first customer swept through the revolving brass doors. Because the store manager liked his cashier stationed and smiling before the lights above the perfume counter finished their slow, theatrical rise. Halcyon's occupied 6 floors of marble and gold leaf in the center of the city, the kind of department store where a single scarf cost more than Maya's rent, and where the women who shopped there had perfected a particular way of looking through service staff instead of at them, as though eye contact might cost extra. Maya had worked Register 4 for 3 years. She knew exactly how to fold tissue paper around a $2,000 handbag without creasing it, knew which of the senior sales associates skimmed commission off items she'd actually helped sell, knew the precise, patient tone required to tell a woman that her platinum card had been declined without making the woman feel the word declined applied to her personally. She had a memory for faces and numbers that bordered on photographic, a fact she'd never mentioned to anyone at Halcyon, because nobody had ever asked what a cashier might be capable of beyond making change quickly. She was quiet. She was patient. She absorbed the small, constant indignities of the job. The sighs when her plus-size frame took a beat too long to reach a bag from the shelf. The customers who addressed her chest instead of her face. The assumption, worn into every interaction like a groove in stone, that a woman built like her, standing behind a register, had nowhere better to be, and she absorbed all of it with a calm, unshakable grace that had taken her years to build out of something that used to be constant, grinding. Fear. That fear had a name. It had walked out of her life 14 months ago with her grandmother's land deed folded into his jacket pocket, and it had been trying to walk back in ever since. The flashback arrived the way it always did, unbidden, somewhere between ringing up a cashmere sweater and bagging a set of monogram towels. Leo's voice, warm at first, warm the way spoiled milk is warm before you notice the smell. Leo, who she'd met at 23 and married 2 years later in a courthouse because he'd told her a real wedding was a waste of money they could invest instead. Leo, who had smiled the whole time he emptied her savings account into a series of failed ventures with names like Reyes Property Holdings and Coastal Equity Partners. Ventures that existed only long enough to make his signature look legitimate on paperwork. Leo, who had discovered, 3 weeks before her grandmother passed, that the old woman's modest plot of land out past the county line, worthless to anyone who didn't know it sat on a parcel a developer was quietly trying to assemble, was suddenly, urgently, the only thing in the world he cared about. He had asked her to sign it over to him for safekeeping, he'd said, so creditors from one of his failed ventures couldn't touch it. She had believed him for exactly 4 days, the 4 days it took her cousin to mention, offhandedly, that Leo had been showing the deed to men in suits who didn't look like they cared about creditors at all. By the time she understood what he actually was, he'd already forged her signature on the transfer paperwork once and been caught only because the notary happened to know her handwriting from years of holiday cards. She'd left him the next week, taking nothing but a duffel bag and the original, and signed deed, which she now kept in a safety deposit box under her maiden name. He had been calling, texting, and eventually showing up ever since, always with the same demand wrapped in a different threat, and always with the same conviction that eventually, if he pushed hard enough, she would simply fold the way she had folded for 2 years of marriage. She had not folded, but she had also never quite believed the fear was finished with her. Not entirely. And some deep animal part of her checked the store's entrance every single morning out of habit before she could stop herself. Which was why, at 11:42 on a Tuesday that had otherwise been unremarkable, when the revolving doors spat Leo out onto the marble floor flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize, her stomach dropped before her mind had even finished registering his face. He'd dressed for the occasion, a blazer too sharp for a man who hadn't held steady work in over a year, the kind of outfit designed to make a scene look legitimate to anyone glancing over from a distance. The two men beside him were not dressed for anything. They had the loose, coiled posture of men paid by the hour for exactly this kind of afternoon, and they fanned out slightly as they walked, boxing the aisle without seeming to try. Leo made a show of it, the way he always made a show of things, raising his voice just enough to carry across the perfume counter and the handbag displays, drawing the attention of shoppers who had, until that moment, been very carefully not noticing anyone at all. "There she is," he announced, loud, performative, grinning at nobody in particular. "My wife. My loving wife, who thinks she can hide behind a cash register and pretend she doesn't owe me anything." Maya's hands stayed steady on the register, though her pulse had already climbed into her throat. "Ex-wife," she said, keeping her voice level, professional, pitched for the customers now openly staring rather than for him. "And I need you to leave the store, Leo." He ignored her entirely, stepping closer, letting his voice climb another notch. "You know what she did?" He turned to the nearest customer, a startled older woman clutching a shopping bag to her chest. "She stole property that belongs to my family. Grandmother's land, promised to me, and she's been hiding the paperwork for over a year like some kind of criminal." "I have never stolen anything from you," Maya said, and this time there was steel underneath the calm, though her hands had begun, very slightly, to shake against the register's edge. "Leave, now, or I'm calling security." "Security," Leo repeated, delighted, as though she'd told a joke. "Go ahead. Call them. Let's see how fast they move for a cashier over a paying customer." He was close enough now that she could smell the cologne he wore too much of, could see the particular manic brightness in his eyes that used to precede the worst nights of their marriage, the nights she'd learned to read from 3 rooms away. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, waving it like a weapon. "Sign it," he said, all pretense of civility gone now, his voice dropping into something uglier, closer, meant for her alone even as the crowd around them widened and stared. "Sign the deed transfer right here, right now, in front of all these nice people, or I swear to God, Maya, I will make sure everyone in this store knows exactly what kind of woman you really are." "I'm not signing anything," she said, and stepped back from the counter, reaching for the small emergency button mounted beneath the register that every associate had been trained on, and none of them had ever actually needed to use. She didn't reach it in time. Leo's hand shot across the counter and closed around her forearm, fingers digging in with a familiar, bruising pressure that sent her back 14 months in a single instant, back to a kitchen she no longer lived in, back to a version of herself she had worked very hard to leave behind. He hauled her sideways, dragging her bodily around the edge of the register, her heels skidding uselessly against the polished marble floor as shoppers gasped and scattered and someone's phone rose to film it, the way phones always did, capturing everything and helping no one. "We're going to the bank," Leo hissed, close to her ear now, his grip tightening as she twisted against him. "You're going to sign whatever I put in front of you, or I swear to God, I'll—" The alarms cut him off. They didn't build gradually the way fire alarms usually did, a slow rising wail that gave people time to brace. They detonated all at once, a full-throated klaxon that seemed to come from every wall simultaneously, and a heartbeat later, heavy steel shutters began dropping over every exit in the store. The revolving front doors, the service entrances, even the loading dock visible through the far windows, sealing the building shut with a series of concussive, metallic booms that shook dust loose from the light fixtures overhead. Leo froze, his grip on Maya's arm going slack with sheer confusion. The two men he'd brought with him exchanged a look that had gone, in the span of a single second, from bored to genuinely alarmed. The private elevator at the back of the perfume floor, the one Maya had walked past 10,000 times without ever once seeing it open, slid apart with a soft, expensive hiss. Viktor Alenko stepped out into the sudden, ringing silence of the frozen store, flanked by 6 men in dark suits who fanned out along the marble floor with the disciplined, unhurried precision of a unit that had done this before and expected to do it again. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The alarms had already done that work for him, and the silence that followed them felt heavier for the contrast. Maya had seen him exactly twice before in 3 years. A tall, unreadable figure crossing the executive floor in a tailored coat, never introduced, never explained, the subject of hushed speculation among the sales staff who all agreed he owned the building and disagreed on almost everything else about him. Up close, for the first time, she understood immediately why nobody on staff had ever managed to get a straight answer out of him. His attention moved once across the frozen tableau. Leo's hand still locked around her arm, the 2 hired men backing slowly toward a wall that no longer had a door in it, and settled with terrible focus on Leo's face. "You have 3 seconds to pray," Viktor said, quiet, almost gentle, in a voice that carried across the entire marble floor without ever seeming to rise. Leo's hand released her arm entirely on its own, some animal instinct overriding whatever was left of his rage. One of Viktor's men crossed the distance in 3 long strides and broke his grip the rest of the way with a single economical motion, twisting Leo's arm behind his back and forcing him to his knees on the marble he'd tried, moments earlier, to drag Maya across. The 2 hired men made the mistake of reaching for something inside their jackets. They were on the floor themselves half a second later, disarmed with a speed and quiet that suggested Viktor's men had spent considerably more hours training for exactly this moment than Leo's men had spent training for anything at all. Viktor crossed the floor toward Maya, and up close, whatever cold authority had radiated off him a moment ago folded away into something careful, almost tender. He shrugged out of his coat without a word and settled it around her trembling shoulders. A small, deliberate gesture that felt, absurdly, like the first kind thing anyone had done for her in that building in 3 years. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes moving over the red marks already blooming on her forearm. "No," she managed, though her voice came out thinner than she wanted it to. I don't understand what just happened. I own this building," Viktor said simply, "and I do not allow men to put their hands on the people who work in it. Especially not you. Especially not." She stopped, startled by the specificity of it, by the way his eyes held hers a half-second too long for the sentence to mean nothing. He didn't explain further, not yet. He nodded once to his men, and Leo was hauled upright, wrists secured, his earlier bravado entirely gone, replaced by a wide-eyed, twitching terror as he was marched toward the service elevator under armed escort, still shouting something about the deed that nobody in the room seemed remotely interested in hearing. Viktor turned back to Maya, extending an arm not to claim her. She understood somehow, but to steady her. "Come with me," he said. "You are done here for the day. Possibly for good, if you'll let me make you an offer." The estate, when they arrived nearly an hour later after a silent, careful drive north through the city and into hills she hadn't known existed so close to it, looked less like the home of a criminal and more like something out of an old European film. Stone and glass and quiet, disciplined gardens, armed men who nodded to Viktor without ever quite looking directly at Maya, as though studying her too openly might be considered a breach of etiquette. He led her into a study-lined floor to ceiling with books that looked red rather than decorative, and for the first time since the alarms had gone off, Maya let herself ask the question that had been building the entire drive. "Why me?" she said. "You could have called the police." You could have had security handle it without ever coming down yourself. Why did the owner of an entire retail empire personally intervene over one cashier and her ex-husband? Victor considered the question with the same unhurried seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. Because I've been watching you work Register 4 for the better part of 8 months, he said finally. Not the way you're thinking. I review the store's internal footage the way any owner should. Theft prevention, staff performance, customer complaints. Most of what I see is forgettable. He paused. You are not forgettable, Maya. I've watched you defuse 3 separate incidents with abusive customers without once losing your composure. I've watched you catch a counterfeit bill that 4 other registers missed that same week. I've watched a woman built for far more than folding scarves quietly decide, every single day, to be underestimated because it was safer than being seen. She stared at him, unsettled by how precisely he described something she had never said out loud to anyone. That's not an answer to why you personally came down there, she said. Because I have wanted an excuse to speak to you for months, he said, with a bluntness that startled her more than anything that had happened all day. And I am not a man who requires much of an excuse once he's decided something is worth pursuing. Today, your ex-husband gave me one considerably more urgent than I would have chosen for myself. She should have found the statement alarming. Instead, sitting in a leather chair in a house that felt more secure than any place she'd lived in 14 months, wrapped in a coat that smelled faintly of cedar and something colder underneath it, she found herself, for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, simply curious. What exactly are you offering me? She asked. A job? A witness protection program? I need to understand what happens after tonight, because I have rent due and a life I still have to go back to eventually. You have a mind for numbers and detail that is being spent entirely on gift receipts and loyalty programs, Victor said. I am offering you a seat at my table, literally and otherwise. I have ledgers that need auditing, patterns that need finding, a business that requires exactly the kind of sharp, quiet attention you've been giving away for free to a department store that will never once notice what it's losing when you eventually leave it. In exchange, you will never again have to wonder whether the man who terrorized you for 2 years is going to walk through a door you can't lock. And if I say no, she said, then I will still make sure Leo never comes near you again, he said. That part isn't conditional on anything. But I would very much prefer you say yes. She didn't say yes that night. But she didn't say no either, and over the following days, as Victor's people quietly, methodically confirmed there would be no consequences to her walking away from Halcyon. Her final paycheck arriving in full, a severance she hadn't asked for attached to it. She found herself returning to the estate anyway, first out of curiosity, then out of something that felt uncomfortably close to belonging. He never once commented on her body the way the world outside had trained her to expect a powerful man might. He noticed, instead, the way she instinctively covered her arms in mirrors, the practiced flatness in her voice whenever anyone complimented her appearance. And he addressed it not with empty flattery but with something more deliberate. A week into her new arrangement, a tailor arrived at the estate with bolts of fabric and a notebook, and Victor, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, watched the woman take Maya's measurements with obvious professional care and said, simply, for her figure, not despite it, when the tailor asked what silhouette he preferred. Maya had stood very still through that sentence, absorbing it the way she absorbed everything, quietly, and had gone to bed that night turning the phrase over in her mind like something she wasn't sure yet how to hold. The dresses that arrived over the following weeks were cut to fit the body she actually had rather than the body the world kept insisting she apologize for, and wearing them, standing beside Victor at increasingly frequent dinners in the estate's formal dining room, she felt something shifting slowly loose in her chest that she didn't yet have language for. The work, when it began in earnest, gave that shifting thing somewhere useful to go. Victor handed her 3 months of shipping and property ledgers from a subsidiary he described only as complicated, and asked her, without further explanation, to find whatever didn't belong. She spent 4 days buried in spreadsheets and scanned documents, her photographic memory for numbers finally given a canvas large enough to matter, and on the 5th day, she found it. A pattern of property transfers routed through shell companies with names that sounded legitimate and weren't. Land deeds authenticated by a notary whose signature, cross-referenced against public records, appeared on documents in 3 different counties on the same afternoon. A physical impossibility that meant someone was forging notarization at scale. She traced the pattern back through 11 separate transactions before she found the name buried at the center of it, listed as a facilitator on paperwork tied to a rival syndicate's real estate laundering operation. Leo. Victor read the report she compiled in complete silence, his jaw tightening by degrees as the picture assembled itself. He is not simply harassing you over your grandmother's land, he said finally. He's been using forged deeds, hers, and apparently several others, to launder property for the Kowalczyk family for over a year. Which means the men who dragged you across that store floor weren't hired muscle collecting a personal debt. They were collateral for a much bigger operation. Maya finished, something cold and clear settling into her chest where fear used to sit instead. And I'm the loose end who could prove it, because I still have the original and signed deed sitting in a bank vault. Which means Leo knows exactly where to look for it. Victor said grimly, once he realizes his forged copy won't survive scrutiny. He realized considerably faster than either of them expected. Within a week, Victor's men intercepted chatter suggesting Leo, panicked, deeper in debt to the Kowalczyk operation than even his forged paperwork could cover, and increasingly desperate to recover something that would buy him back into their good graces, had hired a small crew to track Maya's movements from the estate's outer perimeter, hoping to locate wherever she'd hidden the original documents. It was Maya herself who caught the detail that stopped them before they arrived. Buried in a routine wire transfer flagged by the estate's financial monitoring, money moving through a shell account she recognized from her own audit weeks earlier. She noticed a payment time-stamped and routed in a pattern that matched, almost exactly, the movement of funds preceding 2 prior incidents in Victor's operational history, incidents his security team had filed away as unrelated. She flagged it at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, and Victor's perimeter team moved within the hour, intercepting Leo's hired crew a full half-mile from the estate's outer gate, before a single one of them ever got close enough to see the house. Standing in the command room afterward, watching the security feeds confirm the threat had been neutralized without a single shot fired, Victor turned to her with something in his expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the possessive intensity of the dinners, not the careful tenderness of that first night, but something closer to genuine, startled respect. You just did in one sleepless night what my entire security division missed for 2 years, he said quietly. I told you I was good with numbers, she said, and for the first time since the whole ordeal began, she let herself smile. That night, once the adrenaline had finally drained out of the house and the estate had gone quiet again, Victor found her on the balcony outside her room, staring out at the dark hills, and asked her plainly what she wanted done with Leo now that they had everything they needed to end him permanently. Kill him was the obvious answer, the one his world would have found unremarkable, and she understood, watching Victor's face in the low light, that he would do it without hesitation if she asked. But something in her, something that had spent 14 months rebuilding itself out of fear one careful day at a time, didn't want him erased quietly. She wanted him to feel, in front of witnesses, exactly the powerlessness he had spent 2 years teaching her to feel in private. Don't shoot him, she said slowly, the plan assembling itself as she spoke it aloud for the first time. Ruin him instead. His freedom, his finances, his name, all of it publicly, permanently. I want him on his knees in front of people who matter, the same way he tried to put me on the ground in front of a store full of strangers. Bullets are quick, Victor. I want this to last. Victor studied her for a long moment, something fierce and unmistakably proud moving behind his eyes. Then tell me the plan, he said, because I have a feeling you've already built most of it. She had, over the following 2 weeks, working from the audit she'd already assembled. Maya constructed a trap precise enough that even Leo's rapidly diminishing paranoia wouldn't see it coming. Through a contact inside the Kowalczyk operation that Victor's people quietly cultivated, word reached Leo that a particularly valuable, undocumented parcel of municipal land was going up for private auction, the kind of listing typically reserved for buyers with existing relationships to the seller, exactly the sort of opportunity a desperate, indebted man might see as his last chance to buy his way back into favor. Attached to the listing, buried in paperwork designed to look like an oversight rather than a trap, was a forged deed bearing Maya's grandmother's property description, dangled deliberately as bait for a man who had already proven he couldn't resist the temptation of easy, stolen land. What Leo didn't know, what nobody outside Victor's closest circle knew, was that the auction house hosting the sale had, 3 days earlier, quietly agreed to allow federal prosecutors, already circling the Kowalczyk syndicate's real estate operations for over a year without a single piece of usable documentation, full access to the event, along with every scrap of evidence Maya had spent weeks assembling into an airtight, undeniable case. The morning of the auction, Leo arrived at the municipal hall dressed in a suit he clearly couldn't afford, radiating the particular confidence of a man who believed he was finally about to fix everything at once. He shook hands in the lobby, made small talk with buyers who had no idea what he actually was, and walked into the auction room believing, with his whole desperate heart, that he was 30 minutes away from securing millions of dollars in property that would finally buy his way clear of the debt strangling him. The doors at the back of the hall opened at exactly the moment the auctioneer called the property Leo had come for, and Maya walked through them on Victor's arm, dressed in deep, unapologetic emerald that fit her exactly as it was designed to, commanding the entire room's attention before she'd taken 3 steps into it. She felt every eye shift toward her the way eyes always used to make her want to shrink, and for the first time in her life, standing in that room, she felt them land on her and simply straightened instead. Leo's face went through several stages of confusion before landing, finally, on something close to panic. Maya walked straight to the podium at the front of the hall, Victor half a step behind her rather than beside her. A deliberate choice they'd agreed on together. This moment belonged to her, not to him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply connected the small drive in her hand to the auction hall's projector system, and the screens along every wall filled, in careful, methodical order, with everything she had spent the last month assembling. The forged deed transfers, the notary signature appearing in 3 counties on the same afternoon, the wire transfers routing money through shell companies with Leo's fingerprints all over every one of them, and finally, the original, unforged deed to her grandmother's land, time-stamped and notarized months before Leo had ever touched a copy of it. This is the man who has spent the last 14 months claiming this land belongs to him, Maya said, her voice carrying clean and steady across a room that had gone utterly, breathlessly silent. He forged that claim, along with at least 11 others, to launder stolen property for a criminal organization that has been quietly assembling parcels across this county through fraud and intimidation. Every document behind me is verified, time-stamped, and already in the hands of federal prosecutors seated in this room. The federal agents who had been waiting patiently near the back exits for exactly this cue moved in a smooth, practiced wave, badges appearing, voices calm and procedural in a way that somehow made the moment feel more inevitable than any amount of shouting could have. Leo's face drained of every last trace of color as two agents reached him, and whatever remained of his composure finally, completely collapsed. He didn't run. There was nowhere left to run to. He sank instead, right there on the polished floor of the municipal auction hall in front of buyers, prosecutors, and reporters who had been quietly invited by Victor's people to document the whole thing, dropping to his knees in the exact posture he had once tried to force on Maya, weeping, reaching toward her, begging in a broken, desperate voice for mercy he had never once considered offering her. "Maya, please," he said, his voice cracking apart entirely. "I'll fix it. I'll give it all back. Just don't let them." She looked down at him for a long, quiet moment, and felt, to her own faint surprise, nothing at all, no satisfaction sharp enough to call triumph, no lingering fear, only a vast, settled indifference that felt, after 14 months of carrying something so much heavier, almost like weightlessness. "You already gave everything back," she said quietly. "You just don't get to decide what happens to you now." She turned and walked away without waiting to see him hauled to his feet in handcuffs, without watching the room finish processing what it had just witnessed, Victor falling into step silently beside her. His hand finding the small of her back not to guide her, she understood now, but simply because he wanted to be near her while she walked out of that room the same way she'd walked into it, upright, entirely her own. Weeks later, standing beside Victor on the wide stone balcony of his penthouse high above the city, the skyline glittering gold and blue beneath a sky finally clear of storm clouds, Maya caught her own reflection in the darkened glass of the balcony doors and, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, didn't flinch from what she saw looking back. She saw a woman who had spent years making herself small enough to be safe, who had finally, deliberately stopped. She saw the sharp, careful mind that had once been wasted folding tissue paper around handbags now running the financial architecture of an empire that trusted her judgment absolutely. She saw a body she had once apologized for reflected in emerald silk that had been designed, from the very first measurement, to fit her exactly as she was rather than as anyone thought she should be. Victor's hand settled over hers on the balcony railing, warm and steady, and for once she didn't have to remind herself she was allowed to lean into it. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly, watching her study her own reflection. "That I used to believe surviving Leo was the hardest thing I'd ever have to do," she said. "And it turns out it was only ever the beginning of something much bigger. I just didn't know it yet." Victor turned her gently by the shoulder, until she was facing him instead of the glass. The whole glittering city spread out behind her like something finally, entirely hers to claim. "You are not surviving anymore, Maya," he said, his voice low, certain, carrying none of the careful distance he'd kept in those early days. "You are simply, completely sovereign. And I intend to spend a very long time making sure the world understands that about you." She looked out over the skyline one last time. The city that had once made her feel invisible now spread beneath her feet, lit up and waiting, and let herself, finally, fully believe him.